So, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening, and excited to talk to you about some things that you might not have been aware that Drupal can do using some of the hidden gems that are available on Drupal.org as Contrib projects. So, what we're going to do today is look at 30 different modules that each have less than 2,000 sites that are using it. So, hopefully, there will be some modules in here that are new to everybody in attendance, but we'll see as we go through, and maybe at the end, if there's time, people can share some of the lesser known modules that they enjoy using as well. So already been through the introduction. I guess the one thing I'll point out here, if anybody wants to reach out, they can find me as ManClue on all of the Drupal and social channels as well. Fun fact is that I am actually joining you from London, but the other London, Ontario, Canada, which one of our local satire sites has dubbed the second best London for 161 straight years. That being said, let's dive in and talk about some modules. What I thought we would do is start by talking about some different modules that can really sort of accelerate and make the overall process of site building easier. So the first one that I wanted to talk about is schema.org blueprints. So what it is kind of a framework for building out your content architecture using schema.org as kind of the basis. And so by having that as sort of the fundamental data structure that it's using to inform how you're going to build out your sites, it allows you to follow a number of kind of, industry established best practices around, what are the different properties. There's also some sort of, opinionated pieces built in terms of how to potentially map those to different Drupal fields. And so as a site builder, if you can use that as the basis for a site that you're building, it's going to allow you to build a site that is, from a data standpoint, extremely sound in terms of aligning with, again, schema.org, and really also easily adopt some Drupal best practices. So as part of its ecosystem, there's a variety of these starter kits that you can use. So, again, that idea of saying, if you want to, let's say, create an event system, you can use the starter kit. It's going to have some, best of breed modules sort of built into it and those kinds of things. So definitely something that I would say worth checking out. There is also, well, there's actually a number of demo videos, but I've got one linked here. I'll share the slides afterwards. So if anybody wants to sort of follow up on any of these, do some more reading and so on, you can kind of use the slide deck as a reference as well. So the next one that I wanted to talk about is called content model and site documentation. So instead of starting with, let's say a spreadsheet that has all of your, different specs of how you want things to be built, you can start with something like the schema.org, build out your content infrastructure or content architecture, and then use something like this module to actually generate the reports of exactly how things are set up. And it will do things like use Mermaid.js to generate the diagrams like the one that we can see here, but it's going to be able to document the fields that you have on your site, which entities are using them, what modules you have installed, and a variety of other sort of site information. In the process, you're going to be able to document your overall content model, the architecture. You can have diagrams of your workflow states and transitions. And at the bottom, there's a link to a session from GovCon last year that really sort of went in depth in terms of exactly how this can be used. But using those two pieces together, I feel like has the potential to offer a little bit of a bigger idea, something that I like to think of as build first development. So instead of starting by meticulously spelling out things in, again, that sort of a spreadsheet idea, you can sort of mock out very quickly sections of a website based on some of the initial discovery with a customer or client. And then, as that starts to take shape, you can generate the reports that, any technical team members on their team can pour over in terms of the details of how things will be stored and so on. And really, I think that the promise of that is that it allows you to get to market much quicker. And at that point, you can start to, measure and sort of get feedback in terms of how different aspects of that are going to meet the needs of the various stakeholders, and really, use more of a data-driven approach to sort of, continue to iterate and refine on what you can do as part of that initial build. So this is an idea that I think could be really exciting for the Drupal community, particularly as we get more and more tools. This approach also kind of aligns with some of the work that's been going on recently around recipes as part of Drupal Starshot. All right. So to me, what's really exciting about ECA is that it's a system, and let me start by saying ECA is short for Event Condition Action. So it's a whole system. Effectively, you can think of it as a modern replacement of, what in earlier versions of Drupal people used to use as the rules module, but it's much more sophisticated. Number one, because it has this visual editor. So it's called BPMN. I think it's like Business Process Modeling Notation, something like that. But you can see that there on the right, that it's this whole system where you can sort of visually map out exactly what the logic of this is. It kind of looks like a flow chart. And one of the things that I think is amazing about it is that if you do sort of a decent enough job of labeling all of the different parts of your model, then what you end up with is kind of a visual reference that you can share with even a non-technical user and say, this is the way we have it set up. Is there any, are there any considerations that we're missing? Are there, other factors that we need to sort of work into this to make sure that we sort of properly map out the business logic of how this needs to work? So I think that's pretty amazing. But also then it becomes a way to create very custom functionality within your site without having to write custom code. So there are lots of sites that are still on Drupal 7 today. In some cases, what's holding them back from, migrating to like Drupal 11 is that they have a lot of custom code. And so the potential to leverage something like ECA as a way to migrate into that without having to rewrite code potentially means that it can be a faster process and even, have lower ongoing technical debt, because keeping that as configuration instead of code is going to sort of make for easier maintenance down the road. It also has a very rich system of add-ons. There's lots of documentation. There's a link to a user guide down there. You can actually go in and there are pre-built models you can download and start using. And there's, a really terrific community around ECA. So if you go into the ECA channel of Drupal Slack and, ask a question about something you're trying to do, usually you'll get a really fast response, and they're extremely helpful. So maybe move on to the next slide. So a couple of ones that I wanted to just sort of quickly talk about, because there's probably less to show. The storage module is something that I created as sort of a generic way to make sort of fieldable bundles. So almost like content types, but they're not really intended to be accessed directly on their own. So where sometimes you'll see in a content architecture, people will, create a content type to have some kind of like a nested entity. But because they don't want it accessed directly, then they'll add something like rabbit hole or something like that. Storage is a way to build those out in a way that better reflects the intent to use it in kind of that nested way. And then you can just, through the configuration of your storage bundles, basically say that they shouldn't be allowed to be accessed directly. It could only be through the parent entity kind of a thing. So that one, from like a content modeling standpoint, I feel like works really well. And then as a companion to that, there's a module called Content Auto Grid, which you can use as an easy way to sort of view all of the data that you have, in storage or other kinds of entities as well. And then the last one there is called Node Type Defaults. For whatever reason, Drupal core has some very fixed ideas around, when you create a new content type. As an example, it should have the date and author displayed by default, or it should allow for being included in the main navigation menu by default. And both of those are things that, when I'm creating content types myself, I almost always prefer to have those off when I'm creating new content types. So node type defaults is something where you can basically configure what options you want set as you create new content types. And then that is going to just speed up the process of building out your content architecture and making sure that there's consistency in how certain things are handled. So go to the next slide. So quick links is a module that I put together. In some ways, it's actually very similar to a recipe because for the most part, it's a set of configuration. And what it's going to do is configure a variety of different other modules. So storage that we just talked about, add content by bundle is another one that we're going to talk about later. Display link plus, so when you click on the manage button there, essentially those two modules provide the calls to action. So add link and manage in ways that are sort of permission aware, but you can put them in the context of a view so that from a content editor standpoint, it becomes really obvious of like where to go to manage these different things. It also is using SVG image field as the way to create those SVG icons, and it automatically forces them to use current colors so that they take on sort of the colors and branding of your site through the CSS. And then finally, it also has a draggable views integration, which can be useful for, as a bit of a reference, but also it just makes for a very intuitive way to sort of manage all of those. And it presents all of those icons within a responsive grid display, which was one of the new features in Drupal 10. So it also becomes a nice way to sort of adopt that as a best practice in terms of creating a display that's going to look good across a variety of different devices. So I feel like this is a pretty common, site building pattern that you see. You see it a lot on like municipal sites, hospital sites, a lot of higher ed websites as well. Really any place where there are very specific tasks that they know a high percentage of users are coming for. You can put these at the top. By default, it installs on your homepage, but you can sort of put a set of these anywhere on your site that you need them. Next slide. All right. So next, moving into some slides that can help with, making the process of managing your site easier for your editors. So if you go to the next slide, there's a module called Content Planner, which provides some very interesting functionality to effectively manage the content in your workflow using tools that are similar to what developers are used to for managing, work that they're doing on site code. So you can view a list of content that's in moderation as part of more of like a Kanban style view, or what we're seeing here is more of a calendar view. And the cool thing is that if you schedule content, it'll actually appear in the calendar on the date at which it will be published. And then you can drag it and drop it between days to sort of change interactively, what that scheduled publishing date is. It also has, as part of its dashboards, analytics integration, a variety of other kinds of reporting tools. And again, there's a link at the bottom there to a DrupalCon session from a couple of years ago, if anybody wants to sort of do a bit of a deeper dive. I'm pretty sure there's a 2.0 version of Content Planner that's in the works. I don't have a lot of details yet in terms of what some of the new features are, but this is a really interesting one to watch. Next slide. All right, Tagify is a module that does something that I think is fairly specific, but it does a really nice job of it. So you can sort of see in the animated GIFs on here that it basically takes the tags field that's already in Drupal, but makes it a lot more interactive. So for starters, it can hide the entity IDs, which is, oftentimes an improvement. Sometimes non-technical users get confused as to why there are numbers after all of the tags that they're creating. You can also drag and drop to reorder them. And then you can also do things like include, text or other data essentially from other fields. So you can see in that middle one, it's actually showing icons, or in the bottom, using users, it can actually show kind of their headshot. So again, making it a little bit more intuitive and just overall kind of easier to use. So I really like this one. This is one I use on my own site. I guess the other thing to mention is that it does integrate with the Gin admin theme, which I would say is highly recommended, better exposed filters, and also the Iconify icons, which is also a pretty great module, but not one we're going to talk about today. Next slide. All right, so a couple of other modules to maybe move through quickly. KeySave is a module that does, again, one very specific thing, but I find it very useful. Essentially, if you're in the back end of a Drupal site, I've had the experience of moving back and forth between sort of, the code that I'm working on and then the Drupal interface. And so sometimes after I make a change in the Drupal UI, I'll reflexively do like a Command S to save, and then the browser will sort of open up the save as HTML window, which is basically never what I want. So the key save module, what it'll do is it effectively turn that Command S into something that will save your current entity form or most of your configuration forms. So this is super useful on like the modules page. If you find the module that you want to enable, you just click it and then Command S, and it'll save it and refresh. And in a similar way, on things like the permissions page, really any page that's, extremely long and it would take a lot of scrolling to first find the thing that you need, and then later on to actually go to the bottom and save it. So I find that one super useful. Add content by bundle, as we talked about on the quick link slide, is the one that sort of allows you on any view to say, if you've got a listing of content, make it really obvious for the editor to say, if I want to make a new event, here's a big button to do that. So that's one that I really like from, again, an admin UX standpoint. Entity pre-populate is a nice one for being able to sort of set certain fields with pre-filled values. So you can do things like, say, based on the parameters in a URL, preset the start and end date of an event, or maybe preset an entity reference field based on, what node was used to get you there. So you can sort of automatically have it reference back to the node that linked you to that entity form, those kinds of things. So that, again, kind of a specific use case, but when you need it, it's extremely useful. There is also a module called Entity Reference Override, which is super useful if, let's say, you have related content that you put on, articles that you publish on your site. Sometimes just including the standard teaser doesn't necessarily convey super well in this particular example, why you think it's related. So entity reference override could allow you to do things like write a different summary so that it's more obvious what the connection is. So it allows you to change some of those things. The other use case I've heard for it is like, maybe you've got a project node and you have some people working on the project, but their role on the project is different from what their job title is. So using entity reference override, you could sort of change their title specifically for the use case of how they're associated with that particular project. So that can be super useful and just kind of overall make your site more flexible when you have a lot of different entity references as well. All right, so moving on to the next section. Features, wanted to go through some modules that can really just add some new capabilities to your website. And if you go to the next slide, I think one of the ones that's really the most exciting right now is the AI module. So effectively, they've managed to pull together a number of maintainers that were active, individually on different modules in this sort of AI space for Drupal, and getting them to all collaborate and sort of pull together the best features of all of those different solutions into something that, even though it's only a few months old, is already extremely robust. So you have the ability to use a variety of different AI service providers. You can do all kinds of things. So not just sort of like text generation or, text manipulation, but you can do things like use text to generate an image or automatically generate alt text for an image. So a lot of different powerful ways to sort of manipulate various kinds of media. It does have, as you can see in the image, a built-in chat agent. So the idea of being able to sort of talk to an AI assistant who can potentially even do things like make changes to your Drupal site for you, I think holds a lot of promise, again, in terms of that idea of making Drupal much easier for people who are not technical to get started using it and not have to sort of spend a lot of time digging around in the admin interface to be able to figure out how to change certain things. And there is, again, at the bottom, a link to an introduction video. So if you want to do a deeper dive, you can do that as well. If you go to the next slide, the next module is called Generate Social Media Image. So there's definitely, I would say, a best practice for a variety of different kinds of sites to always have like a social media card. added to the site so that when content is shared via social media, it's got, an optimized banner to really, promote the content in those social channels. And using this module, you can automatically create those. You can set sort of a standard background to use. You can do things like populate different content that should be generated within the card. So example here, we can see it's using the title of the page, the slogan of the website logo, placing those all automatically and dynamically when it creates the card. And then once it has been generated, you can access it through a new token. And that means that you can automatically put it into your meta tags so that when it gets shared on those social channels, it'll automatically pick up that card. And that's what gets shown in, LinkedIn or Twitter, all of those different platforms. The next slide. The next one I wanted to talk about is bookable calendars. So folks may know that I work on Smart Date, and so I do a lot of work in the event space, but one thing I've never fortunately had to spend as much time tackling is the use case of having sort of scarce resources. So the idea of saying, we want to book a meeting room and you can't have two events in the room at the same time, or maybe you have some kind of group session and people can drop in, but not more than 10 at a time. And if you have that kind of a use case, that's perfect for bookable calendar. So it has these different concepts of like calendar as kind of the top level entity or the thing that you're managing in terms of, again, having those scarce resources. Opening is where you define when there are those time slots that can be booked, and you can even set those as kind of recurring events. And then slot is sort of the thing that an individual person can sort of reserve or register for. And so you can define, as you can see in the example here, the first one has 9 slots available and only 1 is left, or the one that's at 9:30 on November the 4th is completely sold out, and so it's automatically changed the call to action there to say there are no slots available. So can be really powerful and also very easy to set up by design. So definitely for that kind of a use case, I think bookable calendar is worth a look. Next slide. So a few smaller ones to mention here. Quizmaker, if you need to create interactive tests, can be very powerful. Has different kinds of questions that you can set. You can set, pass-fail rates. You can get reporting in terms of like, how many people are failing versus passing, all of those different things. If you have a use case where you need to make like organization charts, so like, I guess they call them organograms in some circles. I always heard them referred to as org charts. But the idea of being able to build those in Drupal, I think, is really powerful. It uses actually the taxonomy terms hierarchy system as the way to sort of build out those relationships. But then it actually gives you that visual display generated automatically. And again, not every site is going to need this by any means, but when you do need it, the fact that this is something you can do directly in Drupal, I think is pretty cool. The next one is QR code fields. So you can create a variety of different QR codes. If you want, you can do one that's just the URL of the current page, but you could also do things like, say, if you're looking at a person on your website, you could have a QR code that's got all of their contact information so that, somebody looking at that can just take a picture with their phone and get that contact information added directly into their phone's contacts. Next slide. All right. These next two work pretty well together, so that's why I decided to put them on the same slide. There's a module called wayfinding where you can effectively associate either parts of a single map, particularly an SVG map, or different map images with different sort of Drupal entities. So they could be, buildings or stores in a mall, those kinds of things. And then the wayfinding module can potentially be like an interactive way to see exactly where something in particular is located. It can also be used directly with the digital signage framework. And so you can see in the image there in the kind of the bottom right, how the digital signage can be used to display some of the wayfinding information, which is kind of a natural fit. Now, if you go to the next slide, you can actually see how sort of, the data relationships between the digital signage framework running on Drupal, the wayfinding as the part of the system that manages the different destinations and associates it with the maps, and then has all of that integration with either like Signage OS as the way to integrate with a variety of different display hardware, or you can do something more custom, if you're working with different hardware. But again, the idea of being able to have a pretty robust off-the-shelf system to be able to do all of this in Drupal, I think is actually pretty cool. All right, if you move on to the next slide. Some other things that can be really useful in a Drupal website. Private message is a very robust system that can use a Node.js application to sort of accelerate the process of managing private messages between users. So there's a lot of, very sophisticated technical infrastructure if you need something that's going to be used at scale. Easy Email is a great system for being able to send HTML emails from your Drupal site. So if you only have, let's say, a small number of admin users, then maybe sending out plain text the way Drupal does out of the box is fine. But if it's more of a social site where you want to create a good impression with things like, registration confirmations, or even like e-commerce, receipts and those kinds of things, then sending those via using HTML email is going to definitely create a better impression. So Easy Email is a great solution for that. And then search overrides is a module that you can use to manipulate, or I guess give your editors and admins, really anyone with the correct permission, the ability to sort of manipulate exactly how search results will be returned. So you can say for a specific query, maybe you want to say, I want these two to be at the top of the results and specify the order in which they'll appear. Or you can say maybe these 4 results that keep coming up for a specific search are really like outdated content, and I don't want to unpublish them on the site, but I just want to not have them appear as search results for that particular query. All right, moving on to security. So there's this newer module called Spam Master that has a lot of very sophisticated capabilities to protect your site from different kinds of spam. So in particular, a lot of it related to form submissions, and it uses real-time block lists as a way to help have a bit of a network sense, I guess you would say, of who are the bad actors, and like what email addresses are they using for registration, those kinds of things. So it becomes easier to identify people before they start doing things that are malicious on your site. It can help to detect based on the content of things like comments or other kinds of forms they might be submitting that these are bad actors. And then it also has a variety of built-in reporting so that you can sort of on an ongoing basis see, how are we doing in terms of mitigating these different threats? Is it on the rise? Are there certain, IP addresses that are particularly bad actors? Some of those things as well. One thing to mention is that the service does require a license. So Spam Master is like a third-party service, but there are free licenses available. All right, next slide. A couple of other modules that can help from a security standpoint. Perimeter is a module you can use to essentially identify and block automatically bad actors based on their behavior. So you can do things like say, if on my Drupal site somebody is requesting the path to the WordPress login, they're clearly not, someone who's genuinely trying to use my site. There's somebody who's sort of sniffing for vulnerabilities, so we can just outright block them. So again, by doing those more sort of behavioral based checks, that can be an effective way to, automatically ban nefarious actors. But you may also find that your site is getting a lot of traffic from AI bots where they're not necessarily malicious, but one of the things that AI bots are doing a lot these days is disregarding things like your crawl rate that you might have set in your robots.txt file. So what crawler rate limit can do is basically you set the threshold of how much traffic you want to allow for any particular crawler. And then requests that happen beyond that within that specified time frame will return, I think it's a 407 response, which is sort of temporary unavailable. And so particularly AI bots should learn to not request more than that. But it again becomes a way to sort of enforce those crawl rate limits so that they don't end up like over consuming the resources on your hosting. And then if you go into the next section, a couple of modules around development. So Devel Debug Log is one that I really like for, just working on different modules. So more from a coding standpoint, you can think of it as, maybe an alternative to Xdebug. It works really well with lots of different kinds of requests. So it even works with like, drush commands and asynchronous responses and a variety of different things. So that's one that's kind of like my go-to. The site report, site audit, you can see an example of the report on the right there. So it's going to give you visibility on a variety of different areas. So overall best practices, how your caching is set up, what is the size of your code base and things like how many modules you have installed, cron jobs that are running, the size of your database. If you have some, can find different oddities in your database of like certain tables that are excessively large, how your views are configured, do they all follow best practices in terms of things like requiring at least some kind of permission, and also how large is your overall Watchdog database. So this one you may not need to use all the time, but certainly to have an ongoing sense of how your site is conformed with overall best practices, or before you do something like a rebuild or a migration between hosts, can be really good to sort of again have that sense of overall how well is your site configured. And then the last one is Module Builder, which will help you to build out one or more custom modules on your site. It can automatically scaffold out certain classes based on the kinds of things that you want your module to be able to do. It can generate for you like config entities or content entities. So it becomes a really powerful way to help manage some of what can be the tedious parts of writing custom modules as well. So that was really the look that I had of those 30 different modules, but happy to open it up for questions.
Great. Thanks very much, Martin. Martin, you ever see who's speaking? Hello? Yeah, speak up loud, or maybe come around.
Can you hear me, Martin?
I can hear you, and I think I can see you as well.
Thanks very much for that. You mentioned that you did a module in Canada, right? What was the name of that module?
Oh, you mean at the very beginning? No, so if you go back to, I think it's like slide 3. So where I live in Ontario, Canada, is called, the name of the city is London. It's one of the, like, I don't know, 8 or 10 places in the world that are called London, but there's a local satire website that has this joke that it's named the second best London, 161 years, or I guess now 169 years running. So just meant to be something lighthearted to start off the talk, but without the visual, I think it maybe lost some of the context.
Okay, so you spoke about a module that gave information about events and their availability of spacing.
Event spacing? It sounds like maybe you're talking about bookable calendar.
Bookable calendar, okay? Now, my question,
Okay.
my question is, have you any views on using the module called calendar and also the ECA module, and maybe having some logic there to tell you if something's available?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a valid approach, right? So you could definitely use ECA to do more custom validation to say, you know, are these two things overlapping? And, you know, if they are, then sort of disallow the change. You know, it's sort of, I guess, a question of, number one, like if you're really familiar with ECA, then that may be easier. And then that becomes something that you could sort of maybe bolt on to an existing setup that you have. Whereas going to bookable calendar, if you already have an existing event system and now want to add booking into it, you know, could involve sort of a lot of rework. So ECA would definitely be something that would be easier to sort of add on to an existing event system, I would say.
Thank you.
Yep.
Martin, yeah, thank you for the presentation. Really interesting to watch and learn, and yeah, see your 30 topics of underused or new modules. On the site audit module, what benefits do you think that it has over the status pages in Drupal? You mentioned around information around cron. Does it offer any sort of additional like details or information at a molecular level that you otherwise don't get out of the box with Drupal core?
Definitely. So, you know, particularly I've seen cases where, like from a content model standpoint, it can identify, maybe you've got content types where you only have like 2 or 3 nodes in there. So at that point, you know, again, if you're thinking about doing a rebuild or something like that, or even just, you know, a set of more ambitious updates, that might be a good time to look at that and say, do we still need those content types? Or, you know, it can identify if you've got maybe, you know, database tables that are out of control, which could be a performance problem. And so, you know, maybe there's a different way of storing that data, or maybe loading it from a third-party system on the fly, as opposed to having this, you know, ginormous amount of data that you're managing locally. So I've found it really super useful in terms of really being able, as you say, to get very granular information out of it in terms of things to sort of investigate in a more manual way.
And it plays well with Acquia?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's the kind of a thing that you would probably, it's not something you would want to run like on the server. So you would probably like have a local copy of your site or run this like in like a cloud IDE, that kind of a thing.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you.
No, happy to help. Other questions?
Can I ask you a question, Mark, about Tagify?
Tagify, yep.
Yeah, I really like that. It's a nice visual way to add some, well, add some visual elements to the tags. When those visual elements are added, are they part of the tag element itself? Or is it something, like, I'm thinking about the, sort of the emoji, well, maybe it was the icons with apple, banana, and, yeah, it was cherry, what the other category was it? Are you basically, for those, are you typing in the word apple and then adding an apple emoji, or is that part of an entity of some sort?
So in the example with the icons, it was essentially to say on the tags, there's let's say an icon field. And so when you type apple, it loads that, you know, in this case, it might be a taxonomy term. And then because the icon is already associated with that, it would display that so that it just becomes sort of, again, you know, that visual, you know, extra visual appeal, I guess, of being able to show that in the same way that further down in the user example, it was able to show, you know, the users, not only their username, but also potentially like an image that they might have uploaded. You could have it display other things like their email address or some of those other kinds of things. So it's very flexible, but it's really driven by the data that you have on the actual entity that's being referenced.
Thank you. Martin,
Yeah.
you said that you've been
Yes.
with developing modules since 2005. I'm literally looking now at the site audit module, because that seems like a perfect module for some of the use cases that I've got. And it's sad to see that it's only got 1,030 downloads, and it was created in 2013. In your experience, what tips a module over from being a niche case, which is downloaded by sub 2,000 users, and a module which ends up getting installed on hundreds of thousands of websites? Is there something that those modules do to either solve a problem, or is it word of mouth, like what you do on your podcast, that helps drive forward adoption?
Yeah, there really isn't one thing, I would say, in my experience. It sometimes comes down to, does it solve a very common use case? And if it does, then, what competing solutions are there? Are some of them, very well entrenched and accepted? And if that's the case, then it may be harder for your module to sort of, take hold. In the case of something like site audit, it's probably not something you'd want to have in your code base on production. So more of like a dev dependency. So, I could see that really being limited more. Probably it may be understated in terms of the number of sites that are actually using it, but just because they're not using it in an environment that's like running cron or some of those other things, it just doesn't show up that way. So that one may be underreported, but you do also run into that with some modules where, because they're more of like a developer tool, they're probably just, not showing the number of sites that are actually, they're being used on.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
Martin, thanks for the session. I have a question around this blueprint one, the first.
Okay.
I have used that when it started, and it creates like, if we just create event or organization, it adds up at least 40-50 fields. In some cases, some other bundles like paragraphs with so many fields. And it does not share the fields like we usually do with site building, like we share the same fields in multiple bundles. So that's one issue I see with that blueprint, that let's say there are same field doing same work, but it creates different machines names and all. And the second problem I see with that is like content authoring becomes so complicated. So I did use in one of the website, and when we demoed it, content authors did not like it because it had lots and lots of field to go through. So what's your opinion about that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, my own perspective would be, just because fields are supported by, a specific schema doesn't mean that they're necessarily relevant to your particular use case. So definitely prioritize, what are the fields that actually need to be filled out. If you want to have ones that should be available for kind of occasional use, you could do things like use field group to like throw all of those into a separate tab to say, if the, whatever, like 5 and 100 times you need to fill out one of those fields, they're kind of tucked away there, and then keep, whatever let's say the 5 fields that are the standard ones people are using every day as sort of, the main tab that people are going to see by default.
Okay. And I had another, I think like it's not a question, but I guess you mentioned about a module which help adding content bundle in view. Like,
yep.
I guess that functionality is available in the views now. So in header, if we are filtering a content type, if we provide that as a filter, we can, in the header, we can say, okay, provide a button to add the content bundle, and it just does the same thing what we get, like similar button what we get on content page.
So you're talking about in core, it has the add content bundle at the top of the content page. Is that what you mean?
Yes, like that. In the similar button we can add to any views if we are filtering via a bundle. So there is an option in header to add a button to add that content bundle. So we don't need a module for that.
Okay. I mean, I haven't seen that myself. I know. Yeah, no, it's good information. I mean, I know as an example, the other one that I talked about, the Display Link Plus module, which is the other one that we saw in the Quick Link tab, or Quick Links module. That was slide 11. I don't know if you guys still have the slides up. In core, and again, this is at least the way it used to be, you could add into the header of a view a link to another display, but it wasn't permissions aware. So it would always display that. Whereas one of the benefits of this, a couple of the benefits, number one is you can attach a style. So you can basically say, make it look like a button. And number two, it is permissions aware. So it's not going to show the link to people who don't actually have access to the display.
Yeah, so I'm not pretty sure about the permission part because I haven't used for non-admin things, but for the button thing, it does the same thing like what we see on the content list. So on that view, go to style button that provide, like it simply provide that. Like maybe you can try it. You know,
Cool. No, that's great.
that's
Awesome.
yeah.
Any other questions, comments?
Yes.
I think that's it. Thank you, Martin, very much.
All right. Thanks all.
There's some of the problems we've had. It's still been very, very informative. Thanks very much.
And
Great.
I will come this next week.
Pardon me?
Will come next week. Are you traveling?
Yep, I'll be in Barcelona.
I'll see you there.
Excellent.
Great. We'll see you there.
Great.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much, Martin.
Thanks all.
We'll close Zoom at that stage, I think. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.